Hello, my name is Karen Yost. I'm from Prestera Center, and today is the first of what will be a series of sessions discussing trauma and trauma-sensitive schools. And our hope in this session is that you learn about the impact of trauma on the lives of children and the impact on how they learn and function within the school setting. As a result of this session, we hope that you're going to understand the prevalence and impact of trauma on children and on their behavior and learning, and that you're going to begin to understand the characteristics of what makes a trauma-informed school. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a student who was irritable or hostile, avoidant of school or completing school tasks, chronically poor in self-care and health habits, exhibits confusion or poor memory when being questioned about assignments and information, someone who's stoic and reluctant to admit to problems, or on the other hand can be extremely needy and or demanding? Maybe this child presents a history of substance abuse, depressive symptoms, or chronic relationship problems, and maybe even intermittent history with employment for older children. Maybe this child has problems with learning. Do you know anyone like that? Well, you're not alone. We know that youth with histories of trauma really present to school with many of these characteristics every day. And their behavior interferes with their ability to learn. It interferes with their ability to communicate and have positive interactions with other students and with teachers, and generally just frustrates the school staff. More importantly, these kids are at high risk for academic failure and deteriorating health throughout their lifespan. Most youth who have experienced traumas really don't get help overcoming these because trauma is underreported and underdiagnosed. And even more of the ones who know there are traumatic experiences don't seek mental health services. So when we talk about trauma, and it's a hot topic now, and I'm sure most of you have heard about kids with trauma, and you know many of these kids who have traumatic experiences. But what does that mean to school performance, and how does it relate? Well, kids with traumatic experiences are 2.5 more times likely to fail a grade. They score lower on standardized tests. They're more likely to struggle in receptive and expressive language. They are suspended and expelled more often, and even more behavioral reports to the office. And they're more likely to be referred to special ed. So what I would say to you in the take-home message is that trauma and traumatic experience are pervasive in our lives. And the impact on that trauma is very broad for many individuals and even has life-changing implications. School personnel really can promote healing, and they can prevent traumatization, because what we say is we want to do no harm for these children. And educators and providers alike can have a major healing effect, because all healing happens in relationships. So what does that mean when we talk about trauma? How is that defined, and how do you look at that when you think of trauma? Well, trauma really is defined as an emotional shock. And that emotional shock really can overwhelm a child's ability to cope with it. And it can have lasting damage if it is not resolved. And that damage, you see it in their mental, their physical, and in their emotional growth. Traumatic experiences basically can alter the way an individual looks at themselves, looks at others, and perceives their environment. And we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it affects safety, well-being, and permanence. So if I were explaining traumatic experiences to you for children, I would say this to you. It's like an onion. And when you have an onion, you have a core, and then you have layers. And when you cut into that onion or you peel the onion, you have to peel layer after layer. That's exactly what trauma does, because inside the core of that onion is the pervasive trauma and those experiences. But additional traumas then add more layers to the onion. And so when you're dealing with that onion, you have to start peeling things away because they overlap each other and contribute to what we know onions to be quite stinky situations. There are certain populations that are far more vulnerable to traumatic experiences. Women and children, certainly. Native Indian and Native Alaskan. Veterans, and much of what we know about trauma and PTSD really came from the veterans arena, and how we know that some of these veterans who came back from military experiences active. Refugees and immigrants, people who are homeless. And I include in this people who were in foster care, because children in foster care are considered to be homeless. Individuals who are LGBT and Q, and people who are institutionalized in mental health and criminal justice systems. These are all individuals who are far more susceptible to experiencing traumatic experiences. So trauma can be a single event, it can be a connected series of events, and it can generate chronic, long-lasting stress. And we know that so many children that you serve and that I serve have underlying traumas that have not been addressed. And that even carries into adulthood, into areas like individuals with substance use disorders. So let's look at some of the traumatic experiences. So look at this list and think to yourself, and I will not ask you to raise your hands, how many of you have not experienced one of these events in your life? Is there anyone who hasn't experienced one of these events? It could be the loss, the death of a grandparent, the death of a beloved pet, certainly accidents and homelessness, but think about your school setting. Think about community and school violence, which we know is on the rise. Think about bullying, particularly cyberbullying. And think about how cruel sometimes children can be to other children. Domestic violence. We always consider neglect, child abuse as traumas, and they certainly are, but there are so many more things to this list. Thinking about man-made or natural disasters, how many of you remember exactly where you were when you found out that the Twin Towers were hit? We remember those things because they had such an impact on us. And we may or may not have known anyone who worked in those towers, but it still affected us in some way. Witnessing violence. Children who grow up in violent homes can be traumatized by that violence. Certainly any form of terrorism and refugee and war-torn trauma. So when we talk about traumatic experiences, we're not just talking abuse and neglect. We're talking about a myriad of events that we all experience. So trauma isn't unusual. Trauma is the rule. What is unusual for many of these kids is they're unable to cope with it. So let's look at trauma a little bit more depth. So I talked about trauma being a single event. In 1977, my home county was washed away by a flood. We had 60 feet of water in my hometown, and practically everything was gone. Homes, stores, doctor's offices, just getting food was a challenge, and it was that way for a while. And that one event had an impact on my community for years and years. You have chronic trauma, and that's trauma that's experienced over a period of time or even multiple traumatic events, and they don't have to be the same thing. They can be different events, but you have more than one. Complex trauma is a combination of exposure to traumatic events, but then you also have some kind of implication, some kind of reaction, some kind of impact on that individual, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, we have system-induced trauma. And system-induced trauma is trauma caused to individuals, and in this case we're talking about children, by the very systems who were designed to protect them. Let me give you an example. And I'm sure you've had this happen in your school. You have a child that comes to school that day, and you get a call. And you get a call from the Department of Health and Human Resources. It says, "Don't let Johnny get on the bus today. Keep him in school, we'll be there." So some social worker shows up, some social worker takes Johnny, and Johnny doesn't get to go home that day. Johnny gets to go to a foster home. Now, Johnny wasn't prepared to go to a foster home, and so he didn't get to say goodbye to mom and dad, Spot the dog, or he doesn't have his favorite stuffed animal with him. And he's going to a home where he knows nobody, and he wasn't prepared. The other thing that's system-induced trauma that we see are children who were placed in multiple placements, multiple foster homes, placed in detention centers, placed in some residential care, continuing to be placed. Multiple placements also has a traumatic impact on the children because they believe somehow they are at fault. If a child gets removed from a home, DHHR's responsibility is first of all protect safety of children, and they take that very seriously and they work very hard to do that. But think what that means to a child. Because he or she did nothing wrong, but he or she is the one removed from his home when everybody else is still there. What does that say to a child when children are the very most eager to accept responsibility for what happens to them? What does that say to them about their self-worth? So our systems that are designed to protect children, and I believe do, by the virtue of the processes they have to follow, sometimes re-traumatizes children. And so we need to think about the impact of multiple placements on children and how that impacts them. That's system-induced. And all of those, these children can have one, more, or all of those. So let's look at trauma over the lifespan. Many years ago, not that many, but there was an ACE study, and it was called Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. They looked at 18,000 adults who were middle-class adults, good jobs, good insurance, and what they wanted to find out was there an impact on the lives, the health and lives of these individuals from childhood trauma, and those adverse experiences primarily being domestic violence or abuse and neglect. So they looked at them as adults, and what they found was absolutely there's a strong correlation between adverse childhood experiences and health in later life. And this is how it plays out. Adverse childhood experiences can, by virtue of the way it operates, and we'll talk about this in another session, change our development. It's a disorder of the mind and the memory. And so it changes our neurological and even our biological development. Over time, that has consequences for our social and our emotional and our cognitive impairment. So our ability to think rationally, our ability to develop relationships, our ability to control our emotions then can become impaired. And that leads to adoption of high-risk behaviors. Think of what some of those high-risk behaviors might be. Substance abuse, tobacco use, promiscuous sex. For children, sometimes you have running behaviors. And so they adopt those high-risk behaviors often as a way to escape to something or escape from something. Over time, those high-risk behaviors cause significant impacts to our physical health. We're talking about diseases such as cardiac problems. We're talking about cancer, a lot of times from tobacco. We're talking about liver problems caused by alcoholism. We're talking about diabetes. We're talking about a lot of physical health problems that arise from these unresolved issues. But it isn't just about physical health, it's also about emotional health. Many of these individuals were at higher risk for suicide, higher risk for depression, higher risk for substance abuse disorders, higher risk for relationship problems, higher risk for severe and persistent mental illness. And over time, it led to early death. So many of these individuals with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, their lifespan was shortened by up to 20 years. And we know this. This isn't supposition. We know this based on our research. So there's a real important understanding that we need to take from this to the long-term impact of trauma. So what do you see in schools? Because you have these kids and you know these kids. You're probably sitting there, oh, that's Johnny, or that's Susie, or that's Gage, or that's some other child I know. So let's talk about what you actually see in the classroom that impacts. Well, attachment problems is significant because some of these kids don't relate well to others. They don't have an ability to develop strong and meaningful relationships. They believe the world is uncertain and they believe the world is unpredictable because guess what? It really is. And so they don't believe that they're safe. And so the only person they have really to take care of themselves, quite often, they feel is them. They have biology problems. Many of these kids have problem with cessation and movement. They're not always the most coordinated children. They also can be very hypersensitive to physical contact. So touching these kids, if they're not prepared for that, you'll see startle reflexes and they'll jump. Some of these kids do not like to be touched. A lot of these kids have increased physical symptoms and increased medical problems because we know that unresolved traumas have a detrimental effect on physical health as well. Let's talk about moods. How many of these kids do you have in school that really don't do well controlling their emotions? So they go from 0 to 60 very quickly. Many of these kids are depressed, and they have all kinds of internal states that they can't identify and control. Behaviorally, what you see with these kids, many of them have very poor impulse control. So they can be very self-destructive, they throw fits, they are aggressive with other children, they are self-abusive to themselves. You can see them pulling their hair out, you can see them pulling fingernails out, you can see them cutting on themselves quite frequently, and some of those other risk-taking behaviors that they participate in. And some of these kids, because of their experiences, feel detached. And when things get very unpleasant for them, what they've been able to do is put their minds somewhere else. Now, we all do that. For instance, how many of you have been on the interstate and you drove right by the exit that you needed to get off? And you looked up and you think, oh my gosh, I've driven right by the turn. And why did you do that? It's because you were dissociating. Your mind was somewhere else. I do that at funerals. Funerals are very emotional for me, and I don't always deal with them well. So I think about all the green stuff growing in my refrigerator and my to-do list and what all's sitting on my desk that I have to clean off, because that allows me to remove myself from that highly emotionally charged situation into something else where I am safer. That's called dissociation. We all do it. But for these kids, where they've had to do it so frequently, it kind of takes on a life of their own. But these are the kids that you look out and they just seem to be spacing out from what you were talking about. That's how you'll know. Cognition, the ability to think. So important in schools where we want kids to learn. Many of these kids have a hard time focusing, and they don't complete assignments and tasks. They can't anticipate what's going to happen in the future. They have a lot of learning problems, and they have a lot of problems with language development. These kids have a very hard time learning because they don't think well. And there's a reason they don't think well. We're going to talk about that in a later session, about how the mind, how traumas affect the ability to think. Self-concept. Many of these kids feel shame, and they feel they're to blame for what's happened to them. And some of them have very disturbed body images if they've been physically abused. Some of these kids want to look unattractive, so nobody pays attention to them. And some of them have such disturbed body images that you see things like anorexia and you see bulimia. Loss and betrayal is another big factor for these children, because if you think about it, they've lost parts of their lives, parts of their childhood that they can't get back. Childhood is supposed to be a time of carefree playing, and it isn't for these children who struggle so much. So those parts of their lives are gone, and they can't get them back. And as a result of that, they hang on to everything that they have. Powerlessness is another big issue for these kids, and these are the kids that you see that engage you in power struggles daily. These are the kids that if you say sit here, they want to sit here, simply because you said sit here. Because they perceive themselves as victims, they perceive themselves as having no power, and in reality, children have very little power. Everybody wants to tell kids what to do. And because they know that, they struggle to make sense of their world because they have to control it. And so they engage in all these power struggles, which is a real problem in schools because we have rules that we need to follow, and we expect kids to do this and we expect kids to do that. And for many of these kids, those are just open invitations to challenge authority. and they almost can't help themselves. So when you think about it, let's reframe this. It's about perspective. Everything's about perspective, isn't it? Two people can experience the exact same event and perceive it very differently. We can see that in car accidents all the time. There are several witnesses and everybody saw something different or saw the same thing a different way. So it's all about perspective. And we have our perspective and they have theirs. So look at this side. In the top corner, this is our experience. We think we're sitting there talking to a child. But look at his experience of that event. It isn't the same at all. He perceives it very differently than the way we perceive it. And their perception is their reality. So that's so hard for us sometimes to understand. And sometimes you'll hear kids say, "Stop yelling at me. Quit. Why are you yelling at me?" And our response is, "I'm not yelling at you." And the child says, "Yes, you are. Stop yelling at me." This is exactly what I'm talking about, because it's all about perspective. So let me give you another way to look at children in school and to look at what is so difficult at times for them regard to learning. Abraham Maslow said that behavior is all about getting needs met, that no behavior just occurs because, that we all have a set of needs and that all of our behavior is geared toward getting those needs met. So according to this theory, biological and physical needs, which is the very bottom, those are the basic needs in life. We need air, we need food, we need water, we need to be able to sleep, we need shelter, we need warmth, we need sex. Those are basic, fundamental human needs that we all have. When these needs are met, then the needs that need to be met next are the safety needs. And those are the needs we have for safety and protection, security, limits. Children really do want and need limits. But those limits have to be consistent. And they will test against those limits to see where they are. They need order in their lives. They need stability. And many of these children, particularly children who've grown up with abuse or neglect, those needs are not met. The next set of needs are the needs for belonging and the needs for love. And that's where our families come in, our relationships, our group. And as children get older and they get into adolescence, the group becomes the primary social support for children. Then you move up to if those needs are being met, you move up to the esteem needs, and that's achievement, status, responsibility, reputation. That's where learning happens. That's where learning happens. And then on to self-actualization, which Maslow said was personal growth and fulfillment. And he said not that many people attain that level. I don't really agree with that. I think many more do. But I do agree with the hierarchy, because this is how it works. If your basic needs for shelter, for food, are not met, this is the lowest level, how can we expect children to learn? Because what happens is the lowest level needs are the needs where our behavior happens to get those needs met. The same with safety. Many of the children that we're talking about, traumatized children, their behavior is solely sitting within these two lower levels. These are the children that may eat twice a day, and that's what they eat at school. And they're not going to eat again until the next morning. These are also the children that have to be vigilant all night, because much of their abuse occurred at night. And so they don't sleep. So they come to school tired. And when you're too tired, you don't learn. So many of these children's behavior is geared specifically around meeting the needs in these lower levels. So according to Maslow, I believe in this theory because I've seen it work too many times. How can we expect behavior to focus here when they have these needs that are truly what every human needs, and all their behavior is focused here? So I need you to think about that and look at the children in your classrooms. Think about their histories and think about what's going on with them when we're expecting them to sit and learn, do tasks, when their behavior is geared toward here. So it's a different way of looking at trauma, but it is so true. And if you think about the children you serve, you'll understand it. So now that you've got kind of a general idea of trauma in the lives of some of these children, let's look at some very specific indicators of trauma for children in school centered around learning. So what you have, and young children, it's so exciting to be in elementary schools because kids want to learn. They want to learn to read. They want to please. Younger elementary children, they want to please. They want to do well. They're excited about school. But when you see some of these children that they've lost all pleasure in learning, or they display very little effort, or it's inconsistent. And sometimes for some of these kids, what you'll see is they can do it at 9 in the morning, but when you ask them to do it at 1, they seem to not be able to do it. So sometimes it's inconsistent, their performance. Some of these kids are very difficult to motivate, no matter what you do. And I believe teachers try very hard to motivate children. But some of these kids, it just seems that no matter what you do, you can't motivate them. Some of these kids believe they're not smart at all. And what happens sometimes with them is it's better to act up in class and be known as the class clown than to have people think you're stupid, because they sometimes see themselves as not very smart. And so you see acting out, not really because they want to be the class clown, but it's to hide what they really believe about themselves and what they don't want other people to think about them. How many of those kids do you know? Think about the kids with decreased reading ability. These kids have lower GPAs. And sometimes they relive these experiences. Triggers of trauma really are sensory experiences that come when we don't expect them to come. And they come with these children in different settings, and we can't ever predict them. But their behavior sometimes seems to be and is a reaction to some of those sensory experiences that we don't know what they are. And so these kids are very unpredictable at times. And a lot of times it's because they're reliving that experience. And we see that a lot of times with children who've been verbally and physically abused. And when we interact with those children in a way that's similar to their own traumatic experiences, they react very strongly to that. A lot of these kids are very resistant to rules and authority. No matter what the rule is, it seems that child is determined to break it. And it seems like that's how they focus most of their time. And that's to everybody in authority. They're inconsistent in their attendance, truancy, and they have high dropout rates. And sometimes you see these in families with children whose parents have substance use disorders, because mom and dad aren't getting the child up to go to school, so they have to do it themselves if they do it. And that's pretty hard for young children. These kids, some of them have very low appetite for risk-taking. So you want them to try something new. You can do this, just try, and you'll hear from them, I don't care, or I can't do it. When you know very well from an ability perspective they can do it. But they're not really motivated to step out on that limb and try something that's new and different. And these kids certainly have far more behavior problems. These are the kids that are constantly being sent to the office with a behavior referral. They are suspended more often, and they're certainly expelled from school. So think about, now I've told you what happens to these kids. Describe these kids with these signs and symptoms for you to be aware of. But think about from a whole school perspective. These kids are frequently moved from school to school. They're in this school today, they're in this school tomorrow, and they may be in another county 2 weeks from now. So they have no consistent home school. And as a result, they don't get transitioned well. So they're thrown into yet another situation with another set of people and another set of rules. Just think about trying to get the records for those kids. And what we have, and we know with many of these kids that go from school to school, particularly kids who've pretty much grown up in the state system, is they don't even have a good academic records for them because nobody can keep up with them. And so they'll end up being juniors and seniors and have very few credits toward graduation, which is why the education department has been so great to come up with these alternative graduation projects. A lot of times these kids are labeled as less than academically, and when they're labeled as less than, we treat them as less than, and it means we don't have high expectations for these kids. These kids aren't less than anything. So these kids get referred to special ed most frequently because it's like, oh, this kid's got to go to special ed. I'm just not able to do anything. We got to get them out of my class. A lot of these kids have experienced humiliation in a variety of ways. And for many reasons. It may be their academics, it may be their social skills, it may be physical characteristics. They're not always the most popular kids in the class because sometimes they're not in a school long enough to develop those relationships, and developing relationships is hard for them anyway. One thing that just absolutely hurts my heart, and one way we do this is we call children in foster care, he's a foster. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever said it? He's a foster? As if that's something bad, when all he is a child in foster care. So think about how we refer, think about how your system, your school system refers to many of these children, and what impact that could have on a child. Are they second class? Nobody thinks these children are second class. But they're different, and we treat them differently. They're considered to be not capable a lot of times, and they're difficult, they're challenging. They can interfere with an entire classroom. So not only does that child not learn, but it makes it hard to teach the rest of the children in the class and for them to learn. And that poses a special challenge for teachers, whose job is to make sure that every child learns. So there can be very challenging and difficult children. And sometimes our interventions may be counterproductive or re-traumatizing. Let me give you an example. In my world, by my licensing standards, if you raise your voice at one of our clients, it's considered to be abuse. It's considered to be verbal abuse. It has to be reported. How many of you, or do you know teachers whose way of dealing with these kinds of out of control is to raise your voice? For these children, they're used to that. So the way we interact and the way we respond to some of these children can in fact be counterproductive and in fact be re-traumatizing. So we need to think about how are we approaching these children and responding to them. Not saying they're not frustrating, because they certainly are. But as a school, you can look at how are we responding to the needs of these children and what can we do? How many of you know that one teacher that no matter what happens, that teacher is able to get little Johnny to do what he needs to do? You may not be able to, but there's going to be that one teacher. So what is it about that one teacher that enables that teacher to get little Johnny to do something? Think about it. Look at it. There's always one person. There's always one person, and it only takes one person. It only takes one caring adult to change the life of a child. So let's talk about the purpose. Why are we doing all of this? Why are you sitting here listening to me? Because you can say, this has nothing to do with what I do every day. Teach me something I need to know. What I would say to you is this is exactly what you need to know. Because these county schools are really moving toward trauma-sensitive schools. There's so many wonderful things going on in schools, and many of you have already had trauma training. Many of you already had it. And some of you have maybe even listened to me, so this is like your second or maybe even your third time. But they understand the impact of trauma more now than ever on learning. and school achievement. And so they're moving toward trauma-sensitive schools, and that's the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to give our teachers more information, because if you have more tools in your toolbox, the better able you are to work with these children. The other piece is we're training our new teachers. New teachers are going in the classroom, and it's different now than it was. We hear that all the time. So part of the purpose of this is to also train our new teachers. So we're working toward trauma-sensitive schools. And here are some attributes. And what I would say to you is ask yourself and look at your school. Look at yourself and look at your school and just measure yourself against some of these attributes. Because I would say to you that many schools really are working on these things. So one attribute is a shared understanding of trauma's impact on learning and the need for a school-wide approach to addressing the needs of these kids. How many conversations have you had within your staff meetings about kids who have traumatic experiences and what you're going to do about it? Trauma-sensitive schools support all students to feel safe. We're talking physically, emotionally, socially, and academically. And despite all the school shootings that we've had and the increases in that, schools really are the most safe place for children. And many children feel very safe at school. And some of them, that is the only place where they feel safe. So trauma-sensitive schools address students' needs in holistic ways. In holistic ways, I mean big picture ways, not just little picture ways. They look at their relationships with children. They look at self-regulation. They look at academic competence of these kids. Are they learning? Can they learn? What are you doing to make sure that they learn, even when it's difficult, and even when they do everything they can not to help you? What about their physical and emotional well-being? Trauma-sensitive schools connect students to the school community. The school is a community in and of itself, as you all know. You have a home family and you have a work family. And for many of you teachers, you're a very tight-knit group within your school. And that's wonderful. And how do you then embrace these children to bring them into that? And how do you bring families into that? So what do you do to make your school a large community? Trauma-sensitive schools work together as a team. You learn from each other. You struggle together, which you do now. You rejoice together, which you do now. But how are you going to, as a team, meet the needs of these quite challenging and sad children? Trauma-sensitive schools anticipate and adapt to the ever-changing needs of these kids. It's different from when I was in school. When I was in school many years ago, because I'm 3 days older than dirt, when I got in trouble in school, I got in trouble at home because home knew about it before I got home. So I was in trouble. Now, what happens? Child gets in trouble, and the next morning the parents and they're blaming the teacher because you don't like my kid. Where's the child's responsibility? Where's the parent's responsibility? It is a different world. It is a different world. And being a teacher is the closest thing to sainthood that I know, but it's one of the most challenging things because not only do you have to teach, you end up having to be a surrogate parent. There's so many other things you have to work with children on that really wasn't in your job description to teach, but you got it by default. If you're going to get it by default, we need to prepare you for it. And that's what we're trying to do. These are all attributes of trauma-sensitive schools. Think about your school. Where do you fall within this? Some of you do pretty well, probably. Some of you middle of the road. Some of your schools may just not have thought about it. But these are good places to start. So, as a teacher, as a staff person in the school, what can you do? What does that mean for you? Because I can hear you say, oh yeah, that's well and good. You tell us all this stuff, but I got to go back to work next week. What do I do when I get to work? Well, what you can do is recognize the signs and symptoms and the cumulatively effect of trauma on children and how it's different in age groups. Now, in the next few other sessions, we're going to talk about this. because trauma varies between age groups and how children perceive it and how they respond to it. Recognize the extent to which kids are affected by the event may depend on how often they're reminded of that trauma. There are many children and there are many adults who have lived through traumatic experiences who do very well. Some horrific experiences. There are some that have lived through one traumatic experiences and aren't doing well at all. So part of it depends on a number of things. Part of it is their own resources, part of it is the social support group, and the other is how often this trauma comes back to remind them, and the nature and severity of it. Understand that children don't express their suffering in the same ways that adults do. For many children who are depressed, with adults when we're depressed, we see we're sad and we sleep a lot, we don't get up, we don't take care of personal hygiene. Children who are depressed are frequently very irritable. It isn't about sadness always, they're irritable. So children can't always tell you what's wrong and how they're suffering. And then sometimes you can recognize that a child's bad behavior isn't an adaptation to trauma, it's how they cope. It isn't that that child got up that morning solely to make your life miserable that day, although it sometimes seems that way with kids. But recognize that kids' suffering looks different and that a lot of times their behavior is about somehow adapting to the trauma. These kids are survivors, and a lot of their behavior is survival driven, but it isn't survival driven the way we would think it is. And understand that when you begin to see these kids acting out. What else can you do? Well, you can recognize that education system interventions and responses have the potential to either make it better or make it worse. As with any system, we either make things better or we make things worse. Recognize how your own communication and your own interaction style with these children brings on behavior that hinders learning. Again, screaming at some of these kids, if you are a screamer, doesn't help these kids at all. And in fact, it will not get them to do what you want them to do. And in fact, it may bring on a whole lot of behavior that you really don't want. So you need to be very aware of how you're interacting with them and how what you're doing is making it better or making it worse. And what I would say to you is that one teacher that somehow can get Johnny to do what he needs to do is probably resting in that area. It's how they're responding and interacting. School staff, you need to create a flexible framework within the school because this framework needs to provide universal supports for kids. It's understanding that not all children have while they have the same need, that plays out in a different way. And how do you meet the needs of each and every child? Not a small task. And develop protocols for early identification and connecting them to services before these children get too far along. This is one of those tasks where if you catch them early, it really works. Prevention is worth a pound of cure for these children. Because once these kids travel down the road of disciplinary action and school failure and suspensions and expulsions, it makes it a lot harder. And I'm not talking about always referral to special ed. Everybody within the school has an opportunity and an ability to really interact well with the child. And that's what everybody in the school can do. So any opportunity that you have to interact well. In my school, the most important person was the cook when I was growing up. The cook was the important person because that was the person who fed us and fed us well. We loved the cook. And the cook really had, exerted very little authority. So that was a safe person for us. But the cook's important. So look for ways to identify these kids and interact early so that you can prevent these kids digging a hole. So why do this? What does it mean? Who cares? Why should we have trauma-sensitive schools? Because you get big payoff on the back end. And here are some of those payoffs. Academic achievement increases, as do test scores. So how important is that? Your school climate is improved. It's no longer as difficult to go to work. And I'm talking about the staff. Much better to go to work and have a good day than go to work knowing you're going to go into a war zone, right? Improved teachers' sense of satisfaction and safety. Improved retention of new teachers. I don't know about education, but in my field, workforce is a real challenge. And teachers getting out of the field quickly. Reduction of student behavioral outbursts and referrals to the office. That's important. Reduction of stress for staff and students, because not only are you dealing with trauma of these children, but it creates within the staff traumatic stress at all that is quite debilitating. Reduction in absences, detentions, and suspensions. Reduction in student bullying and harassment. Students do bully. Reduction in referrals for special ed. Special ed teachers probably would appreciate that. And reduction in dropouts. So the payoffs for this are huge because it's what schools are evaluated against. So anything we can do to prevent problems and increase learning is a good thing. So the payoff is great in this initiative. So trauma-sensitive schools are successful. So we've concluded the first session. There will be, I believe, maybe 2 more. But I'll leave you with this. What I've tried to do today is just give you a sense of trauma and give you something to think about, give you some information about what it is. As you go into the classroom this year, I hope you go in with a different perspective and a different sense of how you're going to look at these children and how you're going to respond to these children. In future sessions, we're going to talk more about the physical, how we respond to traumatic stress physically, and we're going to talk about some specific problematic children and how to deal with those in the classroom. But today I just wanted to give you some food for thought, and I hope very much that you will think about it and think about your role and your responsibility in creating a trauma-sensitive school. Thank you very much and have a nice day.